The step down into the earth was like entering a throat of limestone and dust. On a cool November morning in 1964, a kerosene lamp swung from the hand of Chief Inspector Mohammed Mohsen El Batrawi Munir Basta to colleagues as he descended into yet another shaft in the Saqqara necropolis. The light stuttered over hieroglyphs and roughened rock. A moth flared and vanished in the flame. The team moved carefully, breath-measured footfalls muffled by centuries of powder. They had found mastabas before tombs of officials and artisans, scenes of bread baking and cattle counting painted in ochre and lapis. It would be, they thought, another inventory of a life reduced to lists. Then the circle of lamplight slipped across a relief, and time jolted. Two men stood face to face, noses almost touching in the Egyptian gesture of intimacy, what scholars sometimes call the nose kiss. Their arms curved around each other's shoulders with a tenderness as undeniable as it was unexpected. In tomb after tomb, that pose belonged to husband and wife. But here, there was no wife. Here were two men, equal in scale, equal in bearing, equal in the composure of their almond eyes. The inspector lifted the lamp higher. More scenes stepped out of shadow processions of offerings, papyrus marshes thick with birds, boats gliding, the pair enthroned together, supervising estates receiving goods. Names emerged in neat, incised columns. Niankhnum life belongs to Niankhnum and Khnumhotep. Khnum is satisfied. Twin currents braided through the same god, the potter deity who shaped children on his wheel. The room seemed to inhale. One of the workers murmured an invocation. The scribe scribbled faster. The tomb was not merely a record. It was an argument in stone. The team pressed deeper, their lamplight climbing scenes like a second dawn. In one register, the pair sat before laden tables, bread, beer, fowl, each receiving identical offerings. In another, they stood with staffs of office side by side, rather than the usual hierarchy that places one spouse behind the other. There were wives and children, yes, formal, dutiful, recorded. But in the tender panels where intimacy usually widens to include the beloved, the wives receded and the two men remained. Someone noticed with the sharp intake of a scholar's breath, a place where a female figure had once stood and been carefully shaved back, plastered over, repainted, the embrace made exclusive. What exactly had these artists been asked to show? A household, a partnership, a love. The archaeologists began the ordinary work measure photograph, stabilize while understanding. They had stepped into something that would not remain ordinary. Inscriptions identified both men with the same prestigious title, overseer of the manicurists of the palace. To modern ears, it sounds trivial, but in a world where the king's body was divine touch, was theology. To trim the nails of Pharaoh was to handle a boundary between human and God. Those who did it were trusted the way you trust a priest with a secret. If the living king permitted their nearness, perhaps the dead king Osiris would too. Perhaps that nearness is what the walls were insisting upon: equality before the gods and before each other. The chamber's proportions were intimate, almost domestic. A low bench ran under the reliefs, as if inviting a visitor to sit and study the scenes one by one, fowling in marshes, tallying cattle musicians with long-necked lutes. In a niche, a pair of false doors faced one another like mirrors, each inscribed with a man's name and titles, each meant to receive offerings each, a threshold the soul could pass through, to taste bread and beer again. So many tombs speak in the singular my lands, my servants, my provisions. But here, the grammar kept returning to two. Word of the discovery travelled like heat through papyrus. Photographs when they reached offices in Cairo, and then journals abroad ignited arguments. Was this fraternal devotion carved with ceremonial flourish? Were these men brothers, perhaps even twins? Their equality a reflection of shared birth? Or had the artists with the calm directness of Egyptian visual grammar recorded a different kind of union? Two men claiming in public and in perpetuity a bond the culture could understand only by borrowing the language of marriage. But in November 1964, in that carved hush beneath Saqqara's sand debate, had not yet hardened into schools. There was just the flicker of a lamp, the wavering shadow of a human embrace, and the sense felt in the chest before the mind that something unexpectedly human had survived all the miles of time. The inspector reached out, almost touched the stone, then stopped himself. The relief looked close enough to breathe. A pale flake of yellow clung to the lotus blossom in one man's hand. The other's fingers, elegant and long, cupped his partner's shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who had done it often. Outside, the desert evening cooled. Inside, the archaeologists packed their notes, capped their ink, and climbed toward the mouth of the shaft. Behind them, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep remained in their stillness, not frozen exactly, but poised, as if waiting for someone to ask the right question. When the last boot scraped the last rung and the lamplight swung away, the carved embrace did not dim. 4,500 years is a long time for two people to keep a promise. Yet, here they were promising still. Tomorrow, the team would return with scaffolds and floodlights, with conservators and debates. Tomorrow, the world would begin to argue about what these walls meant. Tonight, the tomb held its own council. Two names, one embrace, and a silent claim that would ripple from the old kingdom into ours. Before the debates, before the theories of love or brotherhood, there were simply two men whose lives were intertwined in service to a god. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep were not generals, priests, or viziers. They were overseers of the manicurists of the palace of the king. To modern ears, the title may sound almost trivial, mere attendants trimming nails. But in ancient Egypt, this was a position of immense prestige. For the pharaoh was no ordinary man. He was the Nesubiti, the living Horus, the divine vessel through which the gods ruled Egypt. Every hair on his head, every fold of his garment, every inch of his skin was sacred. To touch him was to approach divinity itself. His body was a temple, and those permitted to maintain it were not mere servants. They were guardians of holiness. Daily Niankhnum and Khnumhotep would kneel beside Pharaoh Nyuserre's golden throne in the palace at Abu Sir, steadying the god-king's hands against ivory tablets. With flint blades sharper than razors, they trimmed and shaped nails that were themselves symbols of perfection. Their work was as much ritual as hygiene, an act of maintaining the cosmic order, ensuring that the king's body remained flawless, a mirror of the eternal order of Ma'at. They belonged to a select circle of attendants whose duties were intimate and highly trusted. The pharaoh's hairdressers arranged elaborate wigs. His perfumers mixed oils of myrrh and lotus. His physicians prescribed remedies, and his keepers of the secrets handled jewelry and cosmetics that symbolized divine power. Within this hierarchy, the manicurists occupied a strangely elevated role. To touch the hands of Pharaoh was to hold the instruments of command, the same hands that signed decrees, accepted offerings, and lifted the crook and flail. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep were not simply barbers of the royal household, they were confidants. Their titles extended beyond manicure. Inscriptions describe them as guardians of the king's things and king's confidants. Such phrases suggest trust that went beyond physical grooming. They likely had access to private chambers, heard conversations no scribe was meant to record, and shared proximity to a ruler who embodied both mortal fragility and divine authority. It is telling that they held these offices jointly. In most palace hierarchies, one man alone was granted a title his assistant recorded only as subordinate. Yet, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep appear together equals in office, both bearing the same exalted role. Their partnership was recognized in the very heart of Pharaoh's inner sanctum. Imagine them at dawn as the palace stirred to life with ritual rhythm. The king's chamber would fill with incense smoke, priests reciting hymns as the divine body was bathed, anointed, dressed in white linen. And there beside all this ceremony, two men knelt in silence, steadying the divine hand's blades flashing like sunlight on the Nile. Theirs was work performed inches from sacred flesh, requiring not just skill, but utter composure. One slip could mean not only disgrace, but sacrilege. The fact that they performed this duty for years, perhaps decades, speaks to both their steadiness and their unusual bond. To Pharaoh they must have appeared almost as a unit. Two men who moved in unison, performed their office with precision, and shared titles as if they were one. In the rigid hierarchy of the Old Kingdom, this equality was itself a quiet anomaly, a ripple that would later echo in the walls of their tomb. To us today, their profession may seem marginal, but in the symbolic universe of Egypt, they were more than attendants. They were trusted keepers of divine touch, mediators between the human and the godlike. And perhaps it was in this proximity to power, in this daily ritual of steadiness and control, that their own unusual partnership was forged once strong enough to leave behind a tomb that dared to show them as equals in love life or something in between. Step inside their tomb at Saqqara, and you immediately notice something unusual. In most mastabas, one man dominates the walls. He is painted larger than his wife, surrounded by children receiving offerings, commanding servants. Hierarchy saturates the art reminders that Egypt was a world of order ranks and rigid roles. But in the tomb of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep, hierarchy dissolves into symmetry. On the eastern wall, they are depicted side by side, identical in size, posture and dress. One does not tower over the other. Their staffs of office, their garments, even their gestures mirror each other perfectly. It is as if the artists working under explicit instruction wanted to say these two are one. Scene after scene repeats the theme. Fishing in the papyrus, marshes, two boats, two men in the same pose, casting their nets in tandem. Hunting waterfowl, both lift their throw sticks at precisely the same angle. Overseeing estate labor, each stands with equal authority, servants arrayed before them as if answering to both. Equality is etched into stone, unyielding and deliberate. This is not how Egyptian tombs usually worked. Even brothers buried together often showed seniority and difference. Here, that difference is erased. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's identities merge into a visual duet, a choreography of mirrored existence. They were not master and assistant, they were partners. And yet, there is another subtler detail. Their wives do appear, but on the margins. One Knut is shown in family groupings with her children. Another Kentikawas is present in formal scenes of inheritance and offerings. But when the walls depict intimacy, the embraces, the shared meals, the nose-to-nose kiss, the wives vanish. In at least one banquet scene, a wife was once present, but later erased, her outline barely visible beneath plaster. In her place stands Khnumhotep, closer than a wife would have been gazing at Niankhnum across a table. The erasure is striking. Tombs were eternal houses of memory. What was carved into limestone was meant to last forever, to secure one's place in the afterlife. To remove a wife from such a scene was not carelessness, it was intention. It signaled that the bond worth remembering, the partnership meant to endure in eternity, was not husband and wife, but man and man. This is why modern scholars return to this tomb again and again. It resists simple classification. If it were merely a double mastaba for brothers, why such painstaking equality? Why the mirrored iconography reserved for spouses? Why erase the wives in the very moments that mattered most? Walk deeper, and the symmetry becomes overwhelming. Offerings of bread, beer, and meat are presented not to one man with his wife beside him, but to both men at once. The inscriptions speak in dual formulas, blessing both equally. Their children, biological offspring from their respective wives, are shown not divided, but arranged as a blended household, encircling both fathers, as if lineage itself had been reshaped into unity. Egyptian art was conservative, bound by convention. To deviate from standard formulas was rare, deliberate, and charged with meaning. That Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb did so repeatedly suggests they were sending a message that in life and in eternity they stood as equals bound together in a way that surpassed ordinary categories of kinship. The power of equality is the tomb's heartbeat. It defies the patriarchal order inscribed in countless mastabas. It silences wives in favor of mirrored men. It makes the walls whisper, "This is a union, not an accident." And so the debate begins not in words, but in images. Were they brothers, twins, or lovers? Was this equality born of blood or of chosen intimacy? Whatever the answer, the tomb at Saqqara insists on one truth. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep wish to be remembered not as individuals, but as two halves of a single whole. If equality was the heartbeat of their tomb, family was its pulse. Across the walls of Saqqara, children appear in abundance, tiny figures with shaved heads, one lock of hair dangling the eternal sign of youth in Egyptian art. Their presence complicates the story, for both Niankhnum and Khnumhotep had wives and offspring. Yet the way these children are depicted suggests something beyond ordinary family portraiture. Niankhnum's children appear with labels naming them 3 sons and 3 daughters. Khnumhotep likewise is shown with 5 sons and 1 daughter. In most tombs, such children cluster behind their biological mother, visually tied to her. Here, they are dispersed, arranged around both men in balanced groups, as if forming a blended household rather than two separate lineages. The composition dissolves distinction. The children orbit two fathers. This visual blending raises profound questions. Was this mere artistic flourish, or an intentional attempt to signal a new kind of family unit? The offering scenes complicate matters further. When priests bring food, beer, and incense, they present them not to a man and his wife, but to both men, together, seated side by side. The inscriptions' lists of provisions for the afterlife duplicate for each, but also merge, treating them as a single cult. This suggests a shared mortuary arrangement. One set of offerings, one eternal household, one unit of remembrance. In Egyptian culture, this was significant. Mortuary cults were carefully planned, often inscribed in contracts to guarantee priests or descendants would tend tombs for centuries. These provisions ensured food for the dead in the afterlife. For Niankhnum and Khnumhotep, to share a cult was to fuse their identities at the deepest religious and legal level. They were preparing not just to live together in memory, but to feed together in eternity. The wives are not absent, but their roles are circumscribed. Khnut Niankkhnum's wife appears in conventional poses in family groupings. Khentekawes Khnumhotep's wife is depicted in formal portraits. Yet, they are peripheral. Their presence establishes respectability, biological continuity, and proper lineage, but they vanish from moments of intimacy. This selective visibility is telling. It acknowledges heterosexual family structure without letting it define the partnership at the tomb's core. The children themselves strengthen the sense of unity. They are drawn in ways that minimize difference between which father sired whom. Some scenes place them all together as though belonging equally to both. This echoes inheritance contracts from the Old Kingdom, where families sometimes arranged for property to pass jointly across blended households. The tomb hints at such arrangements, suggesting that the two men's descendants were expected to cooperate, not compete in sustaining their father's cult. Imagine the message this sent to the living. Visitors entering the tomb would see wives acknowledged, but sidelined children, unified offerings shared, and inscriptions doubled, yet fused. They would leave with the impression of two men who had chosen to merge their lives, their families, and their eternities. Whether this was blood kinship or chosen love, the effect was the same partnership elevated above all else. Even the small details reinforce it. Children are shown playing holding animals, offering flowers. Gestures often directed at both men together. The emotional warmth of these vignettes is rare in Old Kingdom tombs, which typically emphasized formal duty. Here, affection radiates, but it radiates equally toward two fathers. This perhaps is the greatest paradox. These men lived within one of the most hierarchical societies in history, a world where family and inheritance followed rigid patterns. Yet, in their tomb, they carved out a vision of family that bent those rules. A family not defined solely by bloodlines or patriarchal order, but by chosen unity. Two men, two lineages, one household, one cult, one eternity. It forces us to ask, were Niankhnum and Khnumhotep remembered as brothers sharing a household, or as partners crafting a deliberate union beyond convention? The walls do not answer directly, but they whisper insistently. What mattered most was not the wives, nor even the biological children. What mattered was the bond between the two men, a bond strong enough to reorder family itself. The heart of the Saqqara tomb lies not in the formal registers of children or the ritual lists of offerings, but in the intimate moments carved into stone scenes so striking that they have fueled decades of debate. These images do not whisper, they declare. Two men face-to-face noses, almost touching arms entwined, as though in perpetual embrace. In Egyptian iconography, this pose is unmistakable. It is the sniff kiss, a gesture reserved for husband and wife, a visual metaphor for both marital love and erotic union in the afterlife. To see Niankhnum and Khnumhotep depicted in such a way was and remains revolutionary. In hundreds of other tombs, such closeness belonged only to conjugal pairs. The sniff kiss was not a casual greeting, but a deeply symbolic act. Egyptians believed that breath was life itself, the divine force of the Ka, and sharing breath nose to nose signified an eternal bond. For these two men to be locked forever in this gesture suggests they sought to be remembered as more than colleagues or kin. They claimed the imagery of conjugal unity. The lotus scenes add another layer. In Egyptian art, the lotus was a symbol of rebirth and sensual pleasure. It appears in banquet scenes, where wives delicately sniff blossoms, a gesture linked to feminine allure and erotic renewal. Yet in this tomb, Khnumhotep is shown in that pose beside Niankhnum. Here, the conventional feminine role is recast in a same-sex embrace. Art that once divided male and female roles is subverted, as if the two men were declaring, in life and death, we are each other's partners. Other details reinforce this intimacy. They hold hands in scenes of daily life, a gesture rarely given prominence outside of spouses. They share banquets side by side, each attended by offerings not as two separate households, but as one joint seat of honor. In one particularly striking relief, they are shown embracing in the central position of the tomb, where visitors' eyes would be drawn immediately. To center such a scene was no accident. It was a choice to make intimacy their legacy. The boldness of these depictions becomes clear when set against Old Kingdom convention. In typical tombs, the man dominates the space. His figure is largest, his wife positioned behind her arm, resting on his shoulder in a secondary gesture of affection. Children cluster below. Hierarchy is everywhere. But here, the hierarchy dissolves. Both men are equal in size, equally central, equally embraced. The women recede. This art tells a different story, one where partnership outweighs patriarchy. For ancient visitors, the message would have been unmistakable. They knew the visual grammar. They recognized the poses. To see two men represented with marital gestures would have provoked curiosity, perhaps unease. But above all, recognition. This was not just fraternity. This was something deep. Whether the society at large accepted it, we cannot say. But the stone itself insists on recording it. The question then arises, was this intimacy personal or political? Was it simply the reflection of two men who chose to commemorate their love in a bold, unconventional way? Or was it also a statement of their status proximity to Pharaoh, granting them license to redefine convention? As overseers of the manicurists, they touched the divine body of the king. Perhaps that sacred intimacy emboldened them to claim a personal intimacy of their own, worthy of eternal commemoration. Whatever the reason, the art refuses to be ignored. It is both shocking and tender, both conventional in its symbolism and radical in its application. It challenges assumptions about ancient sexuality, family, and art itself. The sniff kiss, the lotus. The hand-holding all conspire to say this was a bond. Like marriage honored in the same way, meant to endure forever. The limestone walls have no voice, yet they speak across 44 centuries. They tell us that intimacy has many forms, that partnership can transcend categories, and that even in a rigid world, two men could carve their closeness into eternity. To truly grasp the significance of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb, we must step back into the broader world of Egypt's 5th dynasty, the age in which they lived, worked, and carved their story into stone. By the time these men walked the halls of Pharaoh Nyuserre's palace around 2380 BCE, Egypt had already entered what historians call the Old Kingdom, a period of extraordinary stability and grandeur. The pyramids of Giza. Those colossal mountains of limestone were already ancient monuments gleaming white under the desert sun, reminders of a golden era of kingship that still defined Egyptian identity. This was a time when Egypt's focus shifted from massive pyramids to solar temples, great sanctuaries to the sun god Ra, built with wide courtyards that captured light and shadow. Pharaoh Nyuserre, the sovereign whom Niankhnum and Khnumhotep served, was a great builder of such temples. His reign emphasized cosmic order, the daily cycle of the sun, and the promise of renewal in the afterlife. It was within this cosmic framework that every act of service in the palace, every ritual, every gesture, even the trimming of the pharaoh's fingernails, was imbued with sacred meaning. Court life revolved around layers of ritual and hierarchy. Pharaoh was not merely a man. He was a god in human form, the living Horus on earth. Around him swirled a carefully organized circle of officials, viziers, priests, scribes, architects, body servants. Each had their place, each title a reflection of both function and proximity to divinity. To be allowed into the pharaoh's presence was itself a privilege. To touch his body was an honor of the highest order. This is the world Niankhnum and Khnumhotep inhabited, a world where grooming was liturgy and proximity to power was destiny. It was also a world defined by wealth and cultural flowering. Egypt's economy drew strength from the Nile's regular floods, which nourished fields of barley and wheat. Surpluses supported great building projects and allowed a class of elites to flourish. Artisans filled tombs with color, and detail sculptors honed their craft in limestone and granite, and hieroglyphic writing matured into a sophisticated system that could record not only transactions, but poetry, prayer, and philosophy. The tomb of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep emerged from this rich environment of artistic mastery funded by the wealth their positions afforded them. But society was not equal. At the base of the pyramid stood laborers, peasants, and slaves bound by obligation and necessity. Above them, scribes and priests wielded power through knowledge and ritual. The court elite, among whom our two men belonged, were the closest to immortality in life, their names carved into stone and their titles passed down. In this hierarchy, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep were not kings, but they were not ordinary officials either. Their shared tomb at Saqqara placed them among the most privileged, their legacy secured, alongside noblemen and priests of the sun temples. It is within this context of rigid order that their equality in art becomes so striking. Egyptian society valued symmetry, but symmetry in relationships was rare. Tombs usually depicted the man larger than his wife, seated at banquets while she stood beside him. Children were shown at a fraction of their father's size, their gestures deferential. To see two men rendered as equals, mirrored in pose, gesture, and status, was not only unusual, it was radical. It suggested a partnership recognized, perhaps even tolerated, at the very heart of Pharaoh's court. Meanwhile, the spiritual environment of the time deepened the significance of their tomb. The afterlife in Egyptian belief was not a place of solitude, but of eternal companionship. Husbands and wives were shown together to ensure they would reunite beyond death. Offerings, prayers, and rituals as were carefully inscribed to provide sustenance for eternity. That Niankhnum and Khnumhotep chose to enshrine themselves side by side in poses reserved for conjugal love reveals a deliberate statement about how they wish to be remembered, not merely as colleagues, not even as brothers, but as eternal partners. And yet, this radical imagery was carved within the most traditional of cultural frameworks. Their tomb was decorated by master artisans of the Old Kingdom, its reliefs painted with lapis blue, red ochre, and gold, the same palette that adorned the tombs of princes and high priests. The structure itself mirrored the mastabas of elite courtiers, with offering chapels, false doors, and painted registers of daily life. In every way except in the intimacy of its imagery, it was conventional. That contrast may have been the key to its survival. By embedding their radical statement within orthodox art, they ensured it was preserved, not destroyed. The world of the Old Kingdom was one of stability, ritual, and hierarchy. But within that world, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep carved something that transcended the order of their time. Their tomb was not just a monument to wealth and status, but a quiet revolution in stone, an assertion that partnership, however unconventional, could endure within the eternal rhythms of Egyptian culture. The embrace on the tomb wall has haunted scholars since the day Munir Basta's lamplight first revealed it in 1964. For decades, Egyptologists studied every carved line, every erased figure, every mirrored gesture, asking the same question: what exactly was the nature of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's relationship? Were they lovers, brothers, twins, or something altogether stranger? The debate has never been settled, but three main theories have come to dominate the conversation, each with its champions, its evidence, and its flaws. The first is perhaps the most compelling to the modern eye: that the two men were lovers, possibly the earliest same-sex couple, memorialized in history. This interpretation was first given serious scholarly weight by Greg Reeder, an independent researcher and editor of KMT, a modern journal of ancient Egypt. Reeder pointed out that the iconography in the tomb, nose-to-nose kisses, shared lotus flowers, intimate embraces, was identical to that used for married couples. In thousands of tombs across Egypt, these poses carried specific meanings: union, eroticism, eternal companionship. If the same gestures appeared between a man and a woman, no scholar would hesitate to call them husband and wife. Why, Reeder asked, should the standard be different here? Reeder also emphasized the conspicuous absence or erasure of wives in these intimate scenes. Both men are shown with wives and children in formal contexts, yet, when the art turns tender, the women vanish. In one banquet scene, traces suggest Niankhnum's wife was originally carved behind him, but later chiseled out and replaced by Khnumhotep. For Reeder, this was no accident, but deliberate. The men had chosen to replace the expected image of husband and wife with each other, declaring in stone the primacy of their bond. But not everyone agreed. John Baines of Oxford University advanced another explanation, one rooted in kinship rather than romance, that Niankhnum and Khnumhotep were brothers, perhaps even twins. Their shared titles mirrored imagery and equality in status could all be explained, Baines argued, by a twin relationship. Twins were viewed with awe in many ancient cultures, often seen as divinely touched. Their very names might reinforce this possibility, both invoking the ram-headed creator god Khnum who shaped children in the womb. The tomb then was less a monument to erotic love than a celebration of an extraordinary fraternal bond, two brothers so close in life that they chose to remain inseparable in death. This theory appealed to scholars wary of projecting modern ideas of sexuality onto the ancient world. It provided a culturally safe explanation that preserved the intimacy of the tomb without requiring acceptance of same-sex love in ancient Egypt. But it also raised questions. Why would wives be erased if the men were merely brothers? Why depict them in poses reserved for conjugal couples when sibling affection was shown differently in Egyptian art? The twin theory explained some aspects, but left others unsatisfying. Then came a more radical proposal. In 2005, David O'Connor of New York University suggested that Niankhnum and Khnumhotep may not have been lovers or symbolic twins at all, but literal conjoined twins. His argument hinged on the extreme mirroring in the tomb art. The men are almost always shown side by side, equal in size, gesture, and dress, sometimes so closely joined that their torsos merge into one. Perhaps O'Connor argued this was not symbolism, but representation. The embrace was not a kiss, but a reflection of their physical reality. Two men fused together from birth, forced to live and work as one. This startling theory gained traction briefly, as it neatly explained their equality shared status and constant pairing. Conjoined twins would indeed be seen as a divine marvel, their connection sanctified by the god Khnum. But the theory soon faced obstacles. The tomb shows the men performing separate tasks, wielding tools independently, and fathering children with wives. These details made it unlikely they were literally fused, though O'Connor argued that Egyptian art was symbolic, not anatomical, and might not depict such details realistically. Still, most scholars found the evidence insufficient. What remains is a triangle of interpretations, each carrying its own weight. Lovers, twins, or conjoined each theory highlights different facets of the evidence. Lovers explains the conjugal imagery and erased wives. Twins explains the equality and mirrored symbolism. Conjoined twins explains the extreme closeness and identical titles. None is definitive. Each is colored by the assumptions and biases of the interpreters, reflecting not just ancient evidence, but modern perspectives on family, sexuality, and identity. And perhaps that is the enduring power of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb. It resists easy categorization. It challenges neat labels. It forces us to ask not only what these men meant to each other, but what we expect of the past. Were they the world's first recorded same-sex couple? Were they brothers whose love transcended death? Or were they something else entirely? A unique union that defies our categories. The debate itself has become part of their legacy, ensuring that their embrace carved in stone continues to spark wonder, controversy, and reflections more than 4,000 years later. For anyone standing in the dim chambers of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb, the intimacy of the artwork is inescapable. The walls do not whisper, they declare. Two men face one another, noses pressed together, arms entwined in gestures reserved almost exclusively for husband and wife. And yet, because we cannot hear their voices, the silence of stone leaves room for doubt. Were these scenes meant to be read as conjugal love, or as something else brotherhood elevated into eternity? The evidence pulls in both directions. On one hand, the erased wife is hard to ignore. In a banquet scene, scholars believe Niankhnum's spouse was once carved in her expected place behind him. At some later point, her figure was removed, and Khnumhotep appears in her stead. Such an alteration suggests intentional replacement. The wife was not his eternal partner Khnumhotep was. In a culture where tomb decoration was painstakingly planned and laden with meaning, the choice to excise a wife speaks volumes. On the other hand, Egyptian society prized kinship ties. Brothers were celebrated as natural allies, and in royal households, especially, fraternal closeness was political as much as emotional. Their shared names, both invoking the god Khnum, could be read as a parental dedication to twin sons. In that light, the tomb might record not defiance of convention, but devotion to divine brotherhood. After all, equality in status and symmetrical depictions are unusual but not impossible for close siblings. The tension deepens when we consider gendered symbolism. In Egyptian art, certain gestures carried unmistakable marital connotations. The lotus, for example, was more than a flower. It was a symbol of sensuality, fertility, and rebirth. To sniff a lotus blossom in the presence of a partner was to claim an erotic afterlife together. In the tomb, Khnumhotep is shown in this pose, filling a role traditionally held by a wife. Scenes of hand-holding, of shared offerings, of embraces, all reinforce this conjugal tone. If these were simply brothers, why are the artistic codes of marriage employed so deliberately? The answer may lie in Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife. Death was not an ending, but a continuation, a perfected version of life. Husbands and wives were depicted together not only to memorialize love, but to guarantee companionship beyond the grave. By commissioning their tomb in this way, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep were making a profound statement that their bond, whatever its precise nature was, the one they wished to carry into eternity. Whether lovers or brothers, they had chosen each other as eternal partners. This possibility unsettles tidy categories. It reminds us that ancient lives may not map neatly onto modern concepts of sexuality or family. The Egyptians themselves may not have drawn the sharp distinctions we insist upon. To them, intimacy, partnership, and household structure might have flowed more fluidly between roles of kinship, marriage, and companionship. And yet, we cannot dismiss the radical nature of their imagery. In a society where wives and children were the anchors of tomb art, two men chose to be remembered as each other's closest companion. The wives are relegated to the margins. The children are arranged symmetrically around both fathers as if belonging equally to each. Every detail elevates their partnership above all others. So was it love or brotherhood? Perhaps the better question is, why must it be one or the other? The truth may be that their bond encompassed elements of both. Brotherhood that felt like love. Love expressed through the language of family. A partnership that refused to be confined by categories, choosing instead to carve its own definition in stone. In this way, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep challenge us not only to interpret their lives, but to reflect on our own assumptions. We crave certainty. Were they gay? Were they twins? Were they conjoined? But the tomb itself resists certainty. It offers instead a message of chosen unity, of two men who decided in life and in death that their names, their titles, their images, and their legacy would be forever joined. The embrace is therefore less about proving one theory over another, and more about the radical act of inscribing equality into eternity. For in a world where tombs were monuments to hierarchy, there's proclaimed something extraordinary: two men side by side, partners beyond death, daring the living to ask still, for the 400 years later, what it truly meant. If the painted embraces and mirrored poses were the poetry of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb, then the objects left behind were its prose. Solid tactile reminders of how these men lived and wished to be remembered. Archaeologists brushing away centuries of dust found not only art upon the walls, but also the physical residue of wealth duty and domestic life that spoke as loudly as any hieroglyph. The tomb itself was a mastaba, that low rectangular structure of limestone blocks characteristic of the Old Kingdom elite. Its construction required resources few outside the royal orbit could command. The very existence of this monument placed Niankhnum and Khnumhotep among Egypt's privileged. To have a tomb in Saqqara's sacred necropolis, within view of Pharaoh's solar temples and the already ancient step pyramid of Djoser, was an honor of status as much as faith. Inside, archaeologists discovered a careful assemblage of goods, the tools of their profession, the ornaments of their status, and the intimate tokens of daily life. Flint blades polished to a razor's edge echoed their work as manicurists to the king. Ivory tablets, smooth, cool, and carved with precision, served as the steadying platforms for Pharaoh's sacred hands. Bronze implements and small alabaster jars of oils suggested that the two men not only trimmed nails, but softened, perfumed, and polished them with priestly reverence. These were not crude workman's tools. They were treasures in themselves, markers of a craft, elevated to ritual. But the tomb held more than the professional. Among the finds were personal ornaments, beads of faience amulets, shaped like protective gods, cosmetic palettes still stained with red and green pigments. Scholars speculate these were not random deposits, but belongings that had touched their lives. Gifts exchanged, charms worn daily. Reminders of intimacy carried even into death. More haunting still were the small toys discovered in burial niches, miniature animals, carved figures, and gaming pieces. These hinted at the presence of children, sons and daughters who had played with them in life, and who would through these objects accompany their fathers into the afterlife. The toys also testified to the men's household wealth. Few could afford such finely crafted playthings, painted with bright colors and shaped by artisans of skill. The artistry of the tomb's walls only reinforced this impression of status. The pigments, even after millennia, still held a startling vibrancy. Deep cobalt blues made from ground lapis lazuli, a mineral imported from as far as Afghanistan. Gleaming yellows from orpiment reds, from iron-rich ochres and greens blended from malachite. To cover walls in such costly colors was an investment in eternity, one that only men of wealth and favor could secure. The carvings themselves displayed the unmistakable hand of royal artisans, the same workshops that decorated Pharaoh's own monuments. Every curve of a lotus, Every ripple in painted water, every fold of linen robes bore the hallmarks of mastery. The offering lists inscribed with rows of hieroglyphs were another revelation. They named the bread, beer, meat, and vegetables required to sustain the dead in perpetuity. But the lists were mirrored for both men, perfectly balanced, as though their partnership required symmetrical sustenance even in eternity. Inscriptions also included contracts and prayers not written in haste, but carved with deliberation, ensuring that their mortuary cult would be maintained, that offerings would be renewed, and that no quarrel between descendants could disturb the unity they had planned. All of this material evidence underscored the same message conveyed in the artwork equality. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep had the means not only to build a tomb, but to fill it with symbols of wealth, domesticity, and devotion. Their choices were deliberate tools beside toys, professional alongside personal ritual, balanced with intimate. The tomb was not a mere house for the dead. It was an argument in limestone and pigment proclaiming their lives, their station, and their partnership. For archaeologists, these finds were not just relics, but context. They reminded us that these were not shadowy figures lost to time, but real men who owned amulets, trimmed nails, watched children play, and planned carefully for death. The craftsmanship, the colors, the contracts all reinforced that Niankhnum and Khnumhotep were men of consequence. But more than that, they had chosen to use their consequence, not to highlight one man above another, but to bind their memory together. It is this combination, the grandeur of royal workshops, the intimacy of toys, the mirrored offerings that makes their tomb unique in Egypt's archaeological record. It is both a monument of status and a whisper of domestic life, both official and personal. And in the interplay between these artifacts, the silent story of two men emerges more clearly than any single inscription could ever tell. If the walls of Saqqara whispered intimacy, it was the scholars of the modern age who turned that whisper into thunder. The discovery of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb in 1964 stirred immediate fascination. But for decades, the academic community treated the embrace cautiously, even evasively. Egyptology, long a field steeped in conservative assumptions, preferred safe explanations: brotherhood, kinship, coincidence. Yet, by the 1990s, cultural winds had shifted. Questions of sexuality representation and identity were no longer taboo. Into this climate stepped Greg Reeder, an independent researcher whose boldness would ignite one of archaeology's fiercest debates. Reeder's argument was deceptively simple. He noted that the intimate poses of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep, nose-to-nose arms, entwined lotus blossoms shared, were iconographically identical to those used for married couples throughout Egyptian art. If the figures had been a man and woman, he wrote, no scholar would hesitate to call them husband and wife. Why then should two men depicted in the same way be denied that interpretation? For Reeder, the tomb was nothing less than the earliest documented same-sex couple in human history, a union celebrated rather than hidden, carved in stone by the royal workshops themselves. This proposal was radical, not because the evidence was flimsy, but because it confronted long-held biases. Egyptology had grown in the shadow of Victorian morality, where discussions of sex were hushed and same-sex love unmentionable. To suggest that two elite men of the Old Kingdom had been lovers was to challenge not just scholarly convention, but the very assumptions underpinning centuries of interpretation. The pushback was swift. John Baines of Oxford University, one of the discipline's most respected voices, rejected readers' reading. The embrace, he argued, need not be erotic. Instead, it could reflect brotherhood, perhaps even twinship. The symmetry of the tomb, the shared titles, the mirrored depictions. These were hallmarks of kinship, not romance. Twins held symbolic power in many cultures, often depicted with unusual intimacy. In this reading, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep were extraordinary, not as lovers, but as brothers who chose to celebrate their closeness through art. The twin theory satisfied many traditionalists. It preserved the intimacy without crossing into the realm of sexuality, offering a comfortable middle ground. But it was not the last word. In 2005, David O'Connor of New York University presented an even more provocative idea. The men were not simply brothers, but conjoined twins. He suggested that Egyptian art, symbolic rather than literal, would not show the physical join. Instead, the imagery of inseparability embraces mirrored poses, fused identities, was the only way to represent their unique condition. The god Khnum, after all, was associated with unusual births. Their shared devotion to him, even in their names, could reflect parental gratitude for such a miraculous arrival. Each theory, lovers' twins conjoined, developed its own camp of supporters. Readers' interpretation resonated in an age of increasing LGBTQ+ visibility, making the tomb a rallying point for discussions of ancient representation. Baines's conservative view appealed to those wary of imposing modern categories on ancient evidence. O'Connor's medicalized explanation fascinated those who saw archaeology as a puzzle best solved through literal logic. The debate spilled beyond academic journals into conferences, museums, and even the media. Popular magazines hailed the tomb as the first gay couple in history, while critics accused them of sensationalism. At conferences, sessions on Niankhnum and Khnumhotep filled auditoriums with young scholars eager to weigh in. The tomb, once a quiet mastaba in Saqqara, had become a lightning rod for contemporary questions about how we read the past. What is striking is not just the disagreement, but the intensity of it. Scholars accused each other of projection, of cultural bias, of twisting evidence to fit ideology. Yet, beneath the arguments lay a shared recognition this tomb mattered. It mattered because its imagery was unique, because it resisted easy categorization, and because it forced the discipline to confront the limits of interpretation. By the early 2000s, the tomb had transcended archaeology. It became a cultural symbol. LGBTQ+ activists embraced Niankhnum and Khnumhotep as historical ancestors, their story invoked in pride, celebrations, and museum exhibits. Conservative commentators bristled accusing academics of rewriting history to suit modern agendas. Egyptologists themselves found their field thrust into wider debates about identity politics and representation. What began in 1964 as a quiet discovery had within a generation become one of the most contested finds in the history of Egyptology. The embrace carved in limestone had sparked not only scholarly wars, but cultural ones, reminding us that the past is never neutral. It is a mirror in which each age sees its own concerns reflected. To understand why Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb ignites such debate, we must step back from the limestone walls of Saqqara and into the broader currents of Egyptian thought. What did the ancient Egyptians actually believe about sex, gender, and love? Were they permissive, repressive, indifferent? The answer is layered, contradictory, and more complex than any single label allows. Unlike the Greeks or Romans, whose writings often theorized openly about sexuality, the Egyptians left few direct commentaries. Their worldview was conveyed through art ritual and myth. Yet, even these fragments reveal a culture where intimacy was integrated into cosmic order, not hidden in shadows. Marriage in Egypt was less a sacred covenant than a social contract, yet it carried profound symbolic weight. Husbands and wives were depicted as complementary halves, their union mirroring the harmony of the gods. In funerary texts, conjugal intimacy was imagined as continuing in the afterlife, ensuring fertility and regeneration. Within this framework, gestures like the nose-to-nose kiss or the sniffing of a lotus blossom were not casual. They were coded with meaning, denoting love and erotic connection meant to endure eternally. Did such codes exclude same-sex bonds? The evidence is murky. Egyptian language does not clearly separate friendship, brotherhood, and partnership in the way modern tongues do. Terms of affection overlap, allowing for interpretations that resist rigid categorization. Moreover, Egyptian art, though formulaic, sometimes hints at alternative relationships. Scenes of men embracing at banquets, women depicted with attributes usually reserved for males, and households that do not fit the nuclear mold, all suggest a society more flexible than later interpreters have assumed. Compared with Greece and Rome, the Egyptians appear less concerned with moralizing about sex. Greek writers endlessly debated pederasty desire and the ethics of male love. Roman law codified prostitution, adultery, and familial duty. Egyptians, by contrast, emphasized balance mart in every aspect of life. As long as order was preserved, personal bonds might have been afforded more freedom. This doesn't mean Egypt was a utopia of tolerance. Adultery could bring shame. Incest among commoners was forbidden, though pharaohs married sisters to claim divine legitimacy, and fertility remained a central expectation of unions. Yet, absence of condemnation is itself revealing. No Egyptian text rails against same-sex desire. No law criminalizes it. Silence in this context may suggest acceptance, or at least indifference. The tomb of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep becomes even more striking in this light. If they were lovers, their bond was not hidden in shame, but displayed in the royal necropolis with artistic conventions of marriage. If they were brothers or twins, their closeness still reflects a cultural willingness to blur boundaries between family intimacy and eternity. Either way, the Egyptians chose to immortalize them in forms that defy strict categories. This flexibility contrasts sharply with later moral codes imposed by outsiders. By the time of the Greeks and Romans, discourses on sexuality had hardened into binaries: acceptable versus deviant, masculine versus effeminate. Egyptian society, 4 centuries earlier, seems to have operated on a looser spectrum, more concerned with cosmic harmony than with regulating personal desire. It is tempting to call this progressiveness, but that would be imposing modern values. Perhaps it is better seen as difference. A society where intimacy could be folded into ritual without becoming scandal, where personal relationships could be represented in stone without fear of moral policing. Niankhnum and Khnumhotep remind us that love in the ancient world did not always wear the labels we expect. Their embrace might be marital, fraternal, or symbolic. What matters is that their society allowed such ambiguity and even honored it with artistry of the highest quality. For modern viewers, this opens a profound question. If the Egyptians of the 5th dynasty could imagine equality between two men in their eternal home, why do so many societies, thousands of years later, still struggle to accept diverse forms of love? For all the power of Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's story, one truth remains: the walls of their tomb whisper, but never shout. They give us gestures, scenes, names, and titles, but they do not give us words that declare love outright. No inscription says husband or beloved. No papyrus scroll records their vows. What survives is imagery carefully chosen and deeply symbolic, yet open to interpretation. This silence has fueled decades of scholarly dispute. To some, the nose-to-nose embrace. The hand-holding and the erasure of a wife's figure are enough to read romance. To others, the same images speak only of kinship, twinship perhaps, or a closeness beyond what our categories can measure. Egypt's artistic conventions were rigid, but they were not transparent. We cannot ask the artists why they placed the men in positions usually reserved for spouses, nor can we know whether those choices reflected reality, aspiration, or metaphor. The absence of certainty is both frustrating and liberating. Archaeology often deals in fragments, broken pottery, faded pigments, half-legible hieroglyphs. To reconstruct entire lives from these shards requires imagination, but imagination must always be tethered to evidence. Push too far, and one risks creating fiction rather than history. Hold back too tightly, and one risks missing the human truths that lie between the lines. This tension defines the debate over Niankhnum and Khnumhotep. Their tomb is unusually rich, yet even here the questions remain. Were they buried together because of love or because of blood? Did they intend their embrace to signal marriage or simply eternal unity of another kind? Did their families support this image, or did they resist, leaving traces of erasures as silent protest? The limits of certainty remind us of archaeology's humility. We can read the walls, but the voices that carved them are gone. We can compare the imagery to thousands of other tombs, but the unique combination here resists easy parallels. The tomb forces us to confront not just what we know, but what we cannot know. And perhaps that is the point. For Niankhnum and Khnumhotep, ambiguity may have been deliberate. In a world governed by marked cosmic balance, they may have sought to craft a memory that transcended labels. To be remembered not as lovers, not as brothers, but simply as two men whose lives were woven together so tightly that even death could not separate them. Their silence becomes their power. In refusing to give us certainty, they give us something else, a mirror. Each generation that gazes upon their tomb sees what it most needs. Scholars of the 1970s saw kinship. Scholars of the 1990s saw queer love. Today, many see a spectrum of possibilities, all valid, all human. The tomb survives because it holds space for all of these readings, an eternal text that reshapes itself with the eyes of its readers. The embrace on the wall is carved forever in stone, but its meaning is carved anew every time we look at it. That is the paradox of history, permanence, and uncertainty entwined. And in that paradox, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep continue to live. What did Niankhnum and Khnumhotep themselves intend? Strip away the scholarly debates, the modern projections, and the centuries of silence. And one question remains. What message did these two men carve into eternity? The walls of their tomb answer not with words, but with images carefully curated. Equality radiates from every panel. Unlike most Egyptian tombs where hierarchy dominates here, the two men stand side by side, their titles identical, their gestures mirrored, their scale equal. In life, they may have held different responsibilities, but in death, they refused separation. Their legacy was not individuality, but unity. Look at the embrace scenes again. Not only nose to nose, but arms entwined, one hand resting gently on the other's shoulder. This intimacy is not casual. In Egyptian funerary art, such gestures meant permanence. They were promises for the afterlife. A wife touching her husband's arm signaled eternal companionship. The lotus blossom before the nose symbolized both pleasure and rebirth. By choosing these conventions, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep claimed for themselves what others reserved for heterosexual marriage partnership beyond death. Their wives appear, yes, but always at the edges in conventional roles, not at the center. The central scenes belong to the two men alone. This careful curation suggests deliberate intent. They wanted the world to see their togetherness not as a footnote to family, but as the heart of their identity. The erasure of Niankhnum's wife in one banquet scene strengthens this reading. At some point, someone decided she did not belong between them. Only Khnumhotep did. Offerings reinforce the message. Two men receive identical gifts, as though the living must honor them equally. Mortuary cult contracts ensured both would be remembered together, their afterlife provisions inseparable. Even their children, clearly biological from different wives, are arranged around both men as though they shared a single household. This was not mere convenience. It was a declaration, whatever the mechanics of their family. Their tombs spoke of one house, one union, one legacy. In every choice of iconography, Niankhnum and Khnumhotep sent a message across time: we are one. Whether that oneness was romantic, fraternal, or something we lack words to describe it, was the image they wished to preserve when their bones turned to dust and their names risked fading. They asked the living and us to remember them, not separately, but together. Perhaps that is why their tomb still stands today. Because the message transcends categories. Because it insists that connection equal, intimate, eternal was the core of their existence. And because in carving that connection in stone, they ensured that thousands of years later, strangers would still pause before their embrace and wonder at the depth of human bonds. Their message is not merely archaeological, it is human. In the silence of the Saqqara tomb, in the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, or the glow of a modern flashlight, we see two men who wanted to be remembered as one. That more than any theory may be the truth they left behind. The tomb at Saqqara does more than preserve two names. It preserves a question, perhaps the oldest question of all. What is the shape of love, and how does it endure? Whether Niankhnum and Khnumhotep were lovers, brothers, or something in between, they chose to bind themselves together in ways that still defy categories. In a civilization built on order, symmetry, and rigid hierarchies, they carved an image of equality. In a culture where tombs shouted individual glory, theirs whispered partnership. In a world where family was defined by lineage, theirs showed a blended household that placed two men at its center. Their decision was deliberate. Tombs were not private diaries. They were public monuments, built for the living as much as for the dead. Every visitor to their mastaba in the centuries after its construction would have seen their embrace, their mirrored poses, their unity. Every priest tending offerings, every descendant reciting prayers, every neighbor passing through the necropolis would have been reminded these two men shared everything in life and in death. That message leaps across 400 years to us. It forces us to reconsider easy assumptions about the past. We often imagine ancient societies as rigid uniform bound by rules we think we understand. But Niankhnum and Khnumhotep's tomb complicates that picture. It suggests that even in one of the world's most tradition-bound civilizations, space existed for bonds that did not fit neatly into categories of husband and wife, father and mother. For modern audiences, their story resonates deeply. LGBTQ+ communities see in their embrace the earliest depiction of same-sex love in art. Others see brotherhood kinship or simply a unique friendship, so profound it blurred the boundaries between roles. Scholars argue, activists celebrate, tourists marvel. Yet, perhaps the most important truth is the simplest they wanted to be remembered together. And they succeeded. 4 millennia later, we speak their names. We debate their intentions. We study the pigments that colored their walls, the hieroglyphs that framed their lives, the scenes that mirrored their partnership. We remember. The question that lingers is not only about them, but about us. What does it mean that two men in ancient Egypt could inscribe their bond into eternity, and that we, in our own fractured age, still struggle with the same questions of recognition, belonging, and love? What does it mean that they found a way to declare equality while we continue to debate it? The stone does not answer. It only shows us what they chose to carve. Intimacy, symmetry, unity. The rest is left to us. So when you think of the great achievements of ancient Egypt, the pyramids gleaming in the sun, the temples rising from the desert, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, remember also the quiet power of a single tomb. A place where two men, manicurists of the Pharaoh, dared to ask eternity to honor their connection. Their story reminds us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about human bonds, about the courage to declare them, about the beauty of carving love into stone. Across millennia, their embrace still holds.